A reading from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. People do not light a lamp and put it under the bushel basket. Rather, they put it on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven.
"89 years ago, a photographer captured a moment in time that at first glance would seem to have been just another ordinary day in the life of Nazi Germany. The date was June 13th, 1936. A large crowd had gathered in Hamburg at the Blom and Voss shipyard for a Nazi rally to christen a new German naval vessel. Adolf Hitler was present for the public display. In the photo, hundreds of men and women are seen enthusiastically raising their right arms toward Hitler for the famous Zeil Heil salute, the official German greeting signaling obedience to the Führer and glorifying the German nation. By 1934, special courts had been established to punish those who refused to perform the salute. Punishments ranged from imprisonment to fines. But in this photograph, among the wave of unbroken, stiff-armed Nazi salutes, stands a lone man with his arms crossed defiantly over his chest, grimacing, refusing to raise his right arm and pay tribute to the Führer. It's a striking image of one man's silent but powerful protest, a moment of defiance in the face of overwhelming pressure. In a sea of salutes, this simple refusal stands out like a lighthouse in a storm. He didn't need to make a scene or give a grand speech. His gesture, or lack thereof, spoke louder than any words. Many believe this man was August Landmesser, an average, hard-working guy who, like many of his peers, had actually joined the Nazi Party in the early 1930s, hoping it would help him land a steady job in a severely depressed economy. But Landmesser ran afoul with the party after falling in love with Irma Eckler, a Jewish woman. His subsequent engagement to Eckler, which was illegal, threw him on a collision course with the regime he had once casually supported. Soon after this photo was taken, the two married. Landmesser was eventually imprisoned for dishonoring the race. It's believed that he later died in a labor camp, and she in a women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück. But perhaps the most compelling part of Landmesser's story is how ordinary he was. He wasn't a political leader or an outspoken activist. He was just an average guy who refused to salute to tyranny. In a world gone mad, he stood still, crossed his arms, and said no. And maybe what's even more compelling is that he never imagined that anyone would be talking about him or his act of defiance decades later. He didn't know that the photographer was taking that picture that day. But what was supposed to be just a photo of another day in the life of Nazi Germany turned out to reveal a moment in the life of one person who seemed to know who he was and what he was unwilling to give his allegiance to. Have you ever thought that what seemed to be merely ordinary moments in the living of our days might actually be moments that define who we are and who we are becoming? Have you ever thought that in those seemingly ordinary moments, someone might actually be watching, hoping you will bear witness to what is right and true. Have you ever thought that courage, faith in action, doesn't have to come in the form of grand speeches or dramatic rebellions, but in simply showing up in the world and daring to be who you are? Jesus did. That's why he called those who follow him salt and light. Speaking to his disciples, one day Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." He speaks these words to ordinary people who had left their fishing nets, tax booths, families, and homes to follow him. Ordinary people, each of whom had once been just another face in the crowd until Jesus calls them. And because they answer the call, Jesus bestows upon them these two new identities: salt of the earth, light of the world. The significance of these earthly, everyday references to salt and light is mostly lost on us moderns. In our top chef post-Edisonian world, salt and light are about as abundant in our daily lives as water and oxygen. Rarely do we ever encounter anything on our daily menu that's prepared without salt. And if the food on our plate ever needs more seasoning, we've got plenty of options. There's sea salt and Himalayan pink salt, table salt, flake salt, red Hawaiian salt, kosher salt, Celtic gray salt, smoked salt, pickling salt. I can go on. You should see our spice rack at home. And rarely, if ever, do we have to endure the inconveniences of a single day or even a moment of unwanted darkness. When the sun goes down, we can simply flip a switch. Candles, those are just for romance and ambiance and fragrance. If we need illumination, we have all the lighting we need: night lights, trim lights, cabinet lights, accent lights, cove lights, task lights, track lights, can lights, pendants, sconces, lamps, LEDs. If the power goes out, we have flashlights. But in the ancient world, salt and light were valuable, essential commodities. Salt was used as a food preservative to prevent spoilage. It was also used for medicinal purposes, to disinfect wounds, to check bleeding, to stimulate thirst and treat skin diseases, making it one of the most valuable trading commodities in the ancient world. Salt was also used as a form of currency. The English word salary actually comes from the Latin salarium, which referred to the common practice of paying Roman soldiers with salt. Try cashing in your container of Morton's at the bank every 2 weeks. Light was equally valuable in the ancient world. Apart from natural sunlight, the only source of light in homes came from oil lamps. Without lamplight, darkness ruled half one's entire life. Lamps made it possible to see in the dark, to work, to eat, to socialize with family and community throughout the night, making those lamps crucial for everyday life. So when Jesus tells his followers, "You are the salt of the earth and the light of the world," he's saying we are as vital to everyday life on earth as these basic, ordinary necessities. In doing so, he's telling us who we are. We are salt, we are light. He's not saying you are supposed to be salt or light, or you can become salt or light if you only would do this or that. The language Jesus uses here is completely descriptive. This is a statement about our identity. We are salt and light. And it reminds us that salt can lose its savoriness, and light can grow dim or even be extinguished. We are the salt of the earth. But here's a challenge. We are either that presence in the world that enhances or embitters, heals or stings, preserves or destroys. For better or worse, we are the salt of the earth, and what we do with our saltiness matters. And we are the light of the world, but we are either that presence in the world that enlightens or confuses, illuminates or darkens, gives off warmth or inflames. What we do with our light matters. Whether we realize it or not, whether we are intentional about it or not, we are always impacting the world we live in. Salt and light, two necessities that sustain life on earth. This is who we are. And as we wrap up our series on the life and witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer today, it is Bonhoeffer who challenges us with this radical claim that, like good salt and good light, those who follow Christ are, as he says, indispensable to the world. Comparing us to salt and light, Bonhoeffer says we are, quote, designated by the symbol of a substance which is indispensable for life on earth, the earth's most noble possession, its most precious asset. Without them, that is, disciples, the earth cannot continue to live. Have you ever thought of yourself as indispensable for life on earth? A lot of people think the whole point of following Christ is actually to get from earth to heaven. The assumption is that if we just believe the right things about Jesus during our brief time here on earth, we'll be rewarded with eternity in heaven. Christianity, according to this view, is essentially an eternal life insurance policy, and our earthly life is simply the premium we must pay before we can cash in on the heavenly benefit. What we do in this life, according to this view, doesn't really matter nearly as much as what we believe. But if that version of Christianity was what Jesus had in mind for us, he might have called us the cherubim and seraphim of heaven instead of the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Jesus says we are as indispensable to this world as salt and light. And the point of following him is not to escape from this earthly world and all of its responsibilities and some pursuit of some heavenly reward, but to claim our indispensable relationship to the world in pursuit of its healing and transformation. Like salt and light, we matter to this world. Being salt and light is a way of being present in the world as a warm and loving presence, radiant with the light of love and truth, salty with justice and compassion, savory as salt that preserves and enhances all that is good in the world, bright as light that reveals and transforms all that is dark in the world. And this, says Bonhoeffer, makes us what he called the visible community. Bonhoeffer said, those who follow are the visible community of faith. Their act of following, of discipleship, is a visible activity singling them out from the world, or it is not discipleship. And this discipleship, he says, is as visible as light in the night, as a hill on the plain. Bonhoeffer wrote these words in a moment of history when too many Christians throughout Germany were either choosing invisibility out of fear of the Nazi regime or accommodating the regime's demands for complete allegiance. Bonhoeffer was speaking to Christians and pastors and churches who had adopted a version of Christianity that had abandoned its responsibility to the real world, preaching a cheap grace that demanded nothing of the individual, advocating withdrawal from the world. It was a Christianity that had lost its saltiness and hid its light. And so he says these words, which are as relevant today as they were in 1934. He says, to flee into invisibility is to deny the call. A congregation of Jesus that seeks to be an invisible congregation is no longer a congregation of disciples. He quotes Jesus' teaching from today's gospel reading. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand. And then Bonhoeffer gives this prophetic warning that it is always the possibility that we deny the call by consciously concealing the light and extinguishing it under the bushel basket, by shrinking, conforming, becoming invisible. And he says this bushel basket, under which the visible community of faith hides, can be both fear of human beings and conscious accommodation to the world for whatever purpose. The fear of human beings and accommodation to the world, these have always been the two powers that have threatened to extinguish the light and to dilute the saltiness of both Christians and the Christian community. Fear of others and trying to fit in. What I have learned over the course of my life and my ministry, sometimes the hard way, is that the first impulse toward either of the two is almost always a call to reclaim my identity as salt and light in this world. A call to recommit myself to what Bonhoeffer described as that visible activity in the world. What did he say? Those who follow are the visible community of faith. Their act of discipleship is a visible activity, singling them out from the world, or it is not discipleship. Which means that the first sign of fear, the fear of speaking up, the fear of asking the hard question, the fear of calling out untruth or doing the unpopular thing, that fear itself is almost always evidence of God's unmistakable call to speak and to act. And the first sign of trying to accommodate the world, to fit in, to blend in, to equivocate, to become invisible, is almost always evidence of God's unambiguous call to stand up and to step out and to lean in and let go. And by acting on those divine calls, what I've invariably discovered is that the fear of others is mostly just an illusion, even when their threats might be very real. And the rewards that are promised whenever we accommodate the world, they are fleeting at best and always come with trade-offs that leave our souls empty. The fear of others, the accommodation of the world, these always pull us further away from the world, away from our identity as salt and light, away from responsibility to the other. Bonhoeffer reminds us that claiming our identity as salt and light will lead us to the cross of Christ, into service within the world, for the world. Not abandonment of the world, but attachment to the world for the sake of its healing and transformation. Salt and light, the visible community, I'm reminded of the story about an Arab Christian pastor in Beirut after the last Arab-Israeli war. In 1983, Israeli troops drove into Lebanon. And members of this little church began to buy all the canned food they could find to survive a rumored Israeli siege. West Beirut had been totally cut off. The church held a meeting to decide how to distribute the food that they had purchased. Two proposals were put on the table. The first was to distribute food to the church members and then to other Christians, and then, if any was left, to their Muslim neighbors. The other proposal was different. First, food would be given to the Muslim neighbors, then to other Christians, and then, if any was left over, to church members. The meeting lasted 6 hours. It ended when an older, quiet, much respected elder, a woman, stood up and said, "If we do not demonstrate the love of Christ in this place, who will?" And so the second motion passed, and they fed their neighbors first. Salt and light, the visible community showing up in the world, for the world. While Bonhoeffer was in prison, he wrote a letter to a friend. The letter was dated July 21st, 1944, a little more than a year before the war would end. Bonhoeffer had come to terms with the fact that he would not get out of prison alive. 9 months later, he would be hanged. In the letter, he wrote these words: "During the past year or so, I have come to appreciate the worldliness of Christianity as never before. I thought I could acquire faith by trying to live a holy life or something like it. Later, I discovered, and am still discovering up to this very moment, that it is only by living completely in the world that one learns to believe." Salt and light, the visible community. Our takeaways for today: Christ has called us salt and light, indispensable to the world. Behind every fear and accommodation is God's call to become more visible. Only by living completely in the world do we learn to believe.